New action in the works to crack down on illegal immigration as migrants rush the U.S. border at record-breaking rates. But the situation still dividing lawmakers on Capitol Hill. Good evening, I'm John Scott, and this is the Fox Report. Customs and Border Patrol is once again sounding the alarm, saying this week apprehensions at the southern border are now off the charts. The worsening situation has prompted Senate Judiciary Committee Chairman Lindsey Graham to propose a change to asylum laws that he plans to bring to the floor in a matter of days.
If you're from Central America, we can't send unaccompanied minors back to Central America like you do from Mexico and Canada. We're going to change that. We're going to change the underlying broken laws to stop what I think is literally an invasion of people from Central America. I'm going to introduce it Wednesday.
Brian Yennis has been looking at this, joins us now with more. Brian.
John, 2019 has had the highest number of border apprehensions we've seen in a decade, and the Trump administration believes we could see over 1 million apprehensions made for the first time since 2006. A Customs and Border Protection source tells Fox News there have been over 504,000 apprehensions so far in fiscal year 2019. To put this in perspective, that number is already higher than what we have seen in every full year since 2009. We still have 4 months left in this fiscal year. This April saw the highest number of apprehensions made in a single month in 12 years. There were more than 98,000 immigrants apprehended in April trying to cross the border illegally. That's up 159% compared to April of last year when 38,000 immigrants were apprehended. The majority of these migrants are from Central America. Earlier today on Sunday Morning Futures with Maria Bartiromo, Republican Senator Lindsey Graham said he will introduce an immigration bill Wednesday that would change our asylum laws and cut illegal immigration by 90%.
You can only hold a minor for 20 days. We're going to go to 100 days. But most importantly, you can no longer apply for asylum at our border. If you're from Central America, you have to apply for asylum at a consulate in your country.
There are currently over 4,300 military troops deployed on the border, including active duty and National Guard. Our Brian Kilmeade on Fox and Friends spoke exclusively with Acting Defense Secretary Patrick Shanahan, who said the troops will remain on the border until the Department of Homeland Security gets more resources to handle this surge.
We're going to be here until the borders are secured. We've got to have the backs of the men and women that are down here being overrun.
John, the number of border apprehensions isn't unprecedented. We averaged 1.2 million apprehensions every year from 1983 to 2006. What's unprecedented here is the number of asylum seekers who are coming into this country. That's families and unaccompanied children who are straining the system. Already on Friday, DHS asked the Pentagon for temporary shelters to house these asylum seekers because these facilities are at capacity.
Now, the numbers are simply stunning. Yep. Brian Yennis, thank you.
Of course.
President Trump blasts intel agencies and Democrats on Twitter today, claiming they improperly spied on his presidential campaign. This comes as the president and House Democrats continue to spar over the release of the full unredacted Mueller report. We have Fox News team coverage on this story. Jillian Turner is in Washington with reaction from Capitol Hill. But we begin with Ellison Barber. She has the latest from the White House. Ellison.
Hi, John. President Trump started off his day by tweeting and attacking Democrats as well as Special Counsel Robert Mueller's Russia probe. He wrote this: "Think of it. Long before I ever took office, I was under a sick and unlawful investigation concerning what has become known as the Russia hoax. My campaign was being seriously spied upon by intel agencies and the Democrats. It all turned out to be a total scam, a witch hunt that yielded no collusion, no obstruction. This must never be allowed to happen again." Earlier this week, lawmakers asked FBI Director Christopher Wray whether or not he thought the Trump campaign was spied on. Here's what he had to say.
There are lots of people have different colloquial phrases. I want to be careful about how I answer that question here because there is an ongoing Inspector General investigation.
Do you have any evidence that any illegal surveillance into the campaigns or individuals associated with the campaigns by the FBI occurred?
I don't think I personally have any evidence.
The president and his aides have repeatedly said there is nothing left to see when it comes to the Russia probe, but Democrats are not ready to move on from their investigations, and neither is the Republican-led Senate Intelligence Committee. They subpoenaed the president's oldest son, Don Jr.
For my son, after being exonerated, to now get a subpoena to go again and speak again after close to 20 hours of telling everybody that would listen about a nothing meeting? Yeah, I'm pretty surprised.
The White House has indicated they will fight every subpoena from congressional Democrats who, among other things, want to see the full unredacted Mueller report. President Trump already invoked executive privilege to block its release. The White House says House Judiciary Chairman Jerry Nadler crossed the line by trying to subpoena it.
Chairman Nadler is asking the Attorney General of the United States to break the law and commit a crime by releasing information that he knows he has no legal authority to have. It's truly outrageous and absurd what the chairman is doing, and he should be embarrassed that he's behaving this way.
When the administration says it will oppose all subpoenas, presumably regardless of its merits, it is saying that it does not recognize Congress having a constitutional oversight authority over the executive branch.
As for the subpoena sent to Don Jr., President Trump retweeted an article about that subpoena earlier today and added his own caption, writing, "Really sad." John.
Allison Barber at the White House. Thank you. The standoff between the White House and Democrat leaders escalating with a host of subpoenas issued by House committees investigating President Trump on a number of fronts, from his tax returns to claims that the president obstructed justice. But some Democrats worry their party is not being aggressive enough. 2020 candidate Seth Moulton says impeachment proceedings are long overdue.
I supported it last year. I think we made a mistake as a party by waiting until the Mueller report came out. The fact of the matter is that this is our constitutional duty. And a lot of people make the argument that it's not a politically opportune time for us to proceed with this, to have this debate. Don't forget, Congress does two things. We debate things and then we vote on them. I'm not saying we should vote on impeachment yet. We don't even have the full Mueller report. But let's have that debate.
Jillian Turner joins us now from Washington with the latest on that. Jillian.
John, congressional Democrats are all aboard the constitutional crisis train today in the wake of the House Judiciary Committee's announcement that Special Counsel Robert Mueller will not testify before the committee this week, as the chairman had hoped.
So I think, yes, I think it is fair to say that we are looking at a crisis, not only of confidence, but potentially a constitutional crisis. Yeah.
He has to be defeated because I don't know how much more our democratic institutions can take of this kind of attack on the rule of law.
I think we made a mistake as a party by waiting until the Mueller report came out. The fact of the matter is that this is our constitutional duty. And
Democrats have issued a slew of subpoenas in recent weeks targeting President Trump and his administration, including a subpoena for his tax returns and one for his son to testify. Republicans are taking to the airwaves today to punch back against their Democratic colleagues, who they say have gone too far.
He's a hypocrite. You know, he was all for President Obama using executive privilege, and now he's against this president. The bottom line is we spent $35 million investigating the president. Their conclusion was there was no underlying crime.
A new front in the battle on Capitol Hill now opening up. Lawmakers have the Attorney General in their crosshairs.
We have the Attorney General who is refusing to show up to give us the information that we're looking for and the information that we are well within our rights to ask for.
Democrats have decided to hold off on a Judiciary Committee resolution holding Attorney General Barr in contempt. The Chairman Nadler, says he's holding off on this vote in order to give administration officials more time to comply with subpoenas that have already been issued relating to the president's business dealings and his political activities. John?
Jillian Turner. Jillian, thank you. Trade talks between the U.S. and China ended Friday with no deal in place, triggering tariffs to more than double on $200 billion in Chinese goods. The president says we are, quote, right where we want to be with China, and is warning its government not to wait for his second term or for Democrats to win the White House. Lawmakers on both sides of the aisle say the trade dispute needs to end soon.
I know of a big prominent company in Kentucky that told me that the tax cuts significantly helped them, but that the tariffs are almost equal in punishing them. The farmers in Kentucky are concerned about the tariffs, and I've talked to the administration about this. The longer we're involved in a tariff battle or a trade war, the better chance there is that we could actually enter into a recession because of it.
Rich Edson has the latest from Washington. Rich.
Well, the U.S.-China trade fight escalates with the White House raising tariffs and preparing to go further. After the latest round of trade discussions ended last week without an agreement, the United States increased tariffs Friday on $200 billion of Chinese imports. The administration says it's beginning the process of even more tariff increases, targeted at $300 billion in additional Chinese imports, covering about every remaining product China sends to the United States. The White House says the two sides were approaching an agreement when China backtracked on significant commitments. The trade fight means higher prices for consumers and less business for American farmers. Top White House economic advisor Larry Kudlow says the U.S. is trying to correct a generation of unfair policies.
I think this is a risk we should and can take without damaging our economy in any appreciable way. Maybe the toughest burden's on the farmers, the agriculture sector. We get that. We've helped them before on lost exports. I think we had an authorization of $12 billion. We will do it again if we have to be, and if the numbers show that out.
China has yet to announce if or how it would retaliate. Administration officials say they're expecting a Chinese government response. China's options against U.S. imports are more limited, since China imports much less than the U.S. imports in Chinese goods. China has yet to announce if or how it will retaliate. Administration officials say they're expecting a Chinese government response. China's options against U.S. imports are more limited, since China imports much less than the U.S. imports in Chinese goods. There are no negotiations scheduled between the two countries, though the White House says there's a good chance President Trump and Chinese President Xi Jinping will meet later next month when they both attend an international summit in Japan. John?
Rich Edson. Thanks, Rich. And candidates for the 2020 Democratic nomination are taking aim at President Trump's trade strategy with China. We'll have some of their reaction later in this newscast. A pilot for a subsidiary of American Airlines arrested at the airport in Louisville, Kentucky, charged in a triple homicide. The state's attorney general says Christian Martin killed a couple and their neighbor back in November 2015. Authorities say the husband was found shot to death in his Pembroke, Kentucky home. The bodies of his wife and neighbor were found a few miles away in a burned-up car in a cornfield. The airline has placed Martin on administrative suspension. A nationwide moment of silence last night for Kendrick Castillo, the victim of last week's shooting at the STEM school in Colorado. The 18-year-old died when he bravely rushed at one of the shooters, saving the lives of his fellow students. His parents now speaking out about the tragedy.
We don't feel our son in our house, and we break down, and that's going to be a thing that it's going to be for quite a while, I would imagine. What is getting us through all of this is the fact that we have people, not just here in Colorado, but around the world, getting to know who my son Kendrick was and the great thing that he did, his heroism. When we see these tragedies, don't focus on the tragedy, focus on the solution.
2 teenage suspects are under arrest in that shooting. They're expected to be officially charged this week. Extreme flooding continues across the South, and it's not showing any signs of letting up. Louisiana declaring a statewide emergency as the banks of the Mississippi River continue to rise, while neighboring states prepare for another round of severe thunderstorms and gale force winds. Meteorologist Adam Klotz is live at the Fox Extreme Weather Center. Adam.
Hey there, John. It has been an absolute mess across the middle of the country. Now, these are flood river gauges. They're across, the Mississippi River and the Missouri River. This is all in the Midwest, but this has been working its way down to the Gulf of Mexico, and we continue to see just these rivers rise and rise as these rounds of showers have continued to move on through. This is a really large system that's kind of made a nasty Mother's Day across a big portion of the country. Maybe some of the worst of it currently in New England, as you're looking at kind of heavy rain, winds getting up to 30, 40 miles an hour in some cases. But this entire system just stretches back down along some of these southeastern states where this rain has just not let up for several days. Now, we are getting a little bit of a break there across Louisiana and Mississippi. We're tracking this as it works its way into the Florida Panhandle now, but there will be more rain eventually on the way, and there's so much that the ground's so saturated, any additional rain becomes a real problem. This is our radar estimated rainfall for the last week. When you start to see these pink colors and these deep red colors, you're getting up to widespread in those regions from 6 inches of rain to 12 inches of rain just in the last week alone. And with the river levels already high, no surprise here that all of that water rushing into rivers and creeks and tributaries, there is a lot of flood warnings across this entire region from eastern Texas through Louisiana into Mississippi and then back all the way up the Mississippi River. This could be until June, until this is actually allowed to kind of funnel its way, work its way out, and then get back out into the Gulf of Mexico, into the ocean. So these high rivers are going to be something that stick with us for a while, even though we're talking about here on our future radar a little bit of a break. This kind of clears out of that region, at least briefly, and we begin to pay more attention to this system lingering across portions of New England. Unfortunately, if you were kind of dodging the raindrops today in the mid-Atlantic and New England, that continues for you on Monday and even into Tuesday morning, bringing with it some kind of chilly temperatures considering the season. This is our forecasted radar, and you're seeing temps getting down into the 40s in Philadelphia, mid-40s into New York City. That continues overnight, only bumping up back close to around 50 degrees tomorrow. So all that rain, John, that those folks are dealing with in the middle of the country, currently on the East Coast. But yeah, there's going to be water for weeks and weeks, it looks like, even if they get a break from the rain.
Meteorologist Adam Klotz. Adam, thanks. Well, the U.S. beefs up its military presence in the Middle East as tensions escalate with Iran. Reaction from our strongest ally in the Middle East coming up. On the Democratic campaign trail, presidential hopefuls are taking aim at President Trump's trade strategy with China after the U.S. more than doubled tariffs on $200 billion worth of Chinese goods on Friday. Now China vows to retaliate. Christina Coleman is live in Los Angeles with reaction from the campaign trail. Christina.
Hi, John. Democratic presidential hopefuls are hitting the president hard on stalled trade negotiations with China, some calling it a disaster and suggesting his strategy could pose a real threat to the U.S. economy.
But putting tariffs on our allies, putting tariffs on even the Chinese that are actually taxes on American producers, American farmers, taxes on the American consumer, and taxes on the American worker, I think are completely the wrong way of doing this.
We need to have a comprehensive strategy for China because they are a massive threat. But just wielding tariffs like a cudgel because it makes the president look tough, that only hurts American families.
California Senator Kamala Harris telling CNN State of the Union this morning she believes Trump's trade policy as a whole doesn't protect American workers and industries. The senator also said she would not have voted for NAFTA and added that climate change also needs to be addressed in trade deals. At a town hall in New Hampshire on Saturday, New York Senator Kirsten Gillibrand called Trump's trade war with China, quote, an absolute disaster, and said his negotiating style was to blame for the stalled trade talks. Gillibrand told the crowd that Trump's 2016 campaign message of no bad trade deals has, in practice, hurt American producers.
I wouldn't be surprised if voters in places like Pennsylvania and Michigan and Wisconsin and Ohio thought that was wise. But he's not done that, actually. He's created disruptors in our trading partners across the globe and started a real trade war with China. I think it's because he's too belligerent. I think he's so overly certain and so self-consumed that he can't actually work well with others and find common ground. Because you really have to spend as much time listening as you are talking, and he has not done that.
As for other candidates in this big field of Democratic presidential hopefuls, Congresswoman Tulsi Gabbard is campaigning in California right now, and Senator Cory Booker will campaign in New Hampshire tonight. John?
Christina Coleman from Los Angeles, thank you. And still ahead, we will have more trade war reaction on Fox News Sunday as Chris Wallace sits down for an exclusive interview with Democratic presidential candidate Seth Moulton. He'll also discuss the Trump administration's stance with White House economic advisor Larry Kudlow. That all happens right after this newscast tonight, 7 p.m. Eastern, here on Fox News Channel. Former Vice President Joe Biden backs a controversial new proposal during one of his recent campaign stops. It's a clear leap to the left for the 2020 candidate who's known for a past as more of a centrist Democrat. Peter Ducey tells us what's going on.
Joe Biden believes the U.S. should be the land of the free. Health care for undocumented immigrants.
Anyone who is in a situation where they need health care, regardless of whether they're documented or undocumented, we have an obligation to keep their kids.
That's the most noteworthy thing he's said about health care since. A confident Biden is also now forecasting when contenders stuck in single digits will start dropping out.
Come out of Iowa, 15% of the caucus. And so it's going to work its way through relatively quickly.
Biden says the time for detailed discussion about policy will be next month's first debate, but Elizabeth Warren doesn't want to wait. She's on the cover of Time magazine next to a headline that's an ode to her rallying cry.
I got a plan for that.
Time reports, quote, her campaign, staffers say, is built on the conviction that voters want substance, not theatrics, and will throw in for the candidate who puts forth serious ideas to create change. President Trump believes his early attacks on Warren knocked her out of contention. He's got his eye now on Biden, Bernie, and...
Boot edge. Boot edge. They say edge.
Mayor Pete might be surging in the States, but President Trump argues he'd stumble on the world stage.
Representing us against President Xi of China. That'll be great. That'll be great. I want to be in that room. I want to watch that one.
The president's rally was in Florida because he can do something Democrats can't do till next year. Their priority is the primary, while the president can use data his team has been collecting since 2016 to focus on the general election already. In Washington, Peter Ducey, Fox News.
A primary set for Tuesday in North Carolina's do-over election after the race was marred by voter fraud in last year's midterms. 10 Republicans are facing off in the state's 9th district, where last fall it looked like former pastor Mark Harris had won. But it wasn't long before evidence of widespread absentee ballot fraud tainted those results. Voters now have a second chance to vote for a GOP challenger to face Democrat Dan McCready in the general election in November. The seat's been left vacant since the new Congress was sworn in back in January. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo will meet Russian President Vladimir Putin this week. Will it help relations between the two nations? That's next. I'm John Scott, and this is the Fox Report. It's the bottom of the hour, and if you're just joining us, Secretary of State Mike Pompeo will visit Russia tomorrow, hoping to repair relations between Washington and Moscow. It's his first meeting with President Putin since the release of the Mueller report on Russia's interference in the 2016 presidential election. Former Defense Secretary Robert Gates says America must do all it can to stop foreign interference in our elections.
The piece of the Mueller report about Russian interference is not case closed. And frankly, I think elected officials who depend on honest elections to get elected ought to place as a very high priority measures to protect the American electoral system against interference by foreigners.
Let's bring in David Mark. He's news editor for the Washington Examiner. The Russians like to see chaos in the American democratic system. What kind of leverage does the Secretary of State have against, say, the foreign minister or the president of Russia?
In theory, there's a lot of leverage. There are potential threats of pushing back on Russia's own systems. They don't exactly have a free and fair election system, that they have all kind of infrastructure, grids, etc. There's no evidence that the administration is going that route. I do, however, think Secretary Pompeo is going over there to deliver a stern message on any number of issues like Venezuela and other matters.
So when compared with, say, a summit meeting between the two presidents, is Secretary Pompeo allowed to play a little bit of a different role here?
Right. This is really where a lot of the actual work of statecraft gets done. At the, you might say, the deputy level, the Secretary of State is essentially the foreign policy emissary of the president. And in this case, that's really true. President Trump and Secretary Pompeo have, by all accounts, a very close relationship. And foreign leaders know when Secretary Pompeo is there, he's speaking for the president. It's really kind of a good cop, bad cop type relationship. The president and President Trump and President Putin, when they get together, it's more on the sidelines of meetings, a lot of diplomatic talk. Once the Secretary of State and Russian President Putin go behind closed doors, it's a different matter. They are getting down to business.
In that interview, the former Secretary of Defense, Robert Gates, suggested that the United States might employ a little bit of, shall we say, statecraft of its own by sort of illuminating what's going on in Russia. Listen.
But it's perhaps a certain set of sanctions. It's also using some of our own capabilities to go back into Russia and, let's say, inform the Russian people of the magnitude of corruption of Putin and And I think we can make a case about that. And I think we can create more problems for him.
Because Putin does do a very good job of keeping his own people misinformed.
Sure, the press is completely under Kremlin control or close to it. Opposition voices are stifled. There are all kinds of ways of opening up the internet, other forms in Russia of getting information out there. Radio Free Europe, just outside of Russia's borders, playing other countries against Russia in the region who are not big fans, the Baltic states and others. It's a question of will, however. Does President Trump want to go down that route? So far, we haven't seen a lot of evidence of it.
Yeah, he spoke with Vladimir Putin earlier this month in a 90-minute phone call. He says election meddling is not even something that came up. Listen.
We discussed it. He actually sort of smiled when he said something to the effect that it started off as a mountain and it ended up being a mouse. But he knew that because he knew there was no collusion whatsoever.
Did you ask him not to meddle in the next election?
We didn't discuss that. Really, we didn't discuss it.
So he started off there talking about the Mueller report, claiming that Vladimir Putin told him it started out as a mountain, became a mouse, but that they did not discuss election meddling. Is that something the president just doesn't want to bring up with Putin?
Clearly, he's essentially labeled all Russia collusion, anything to do with Russian interference, a hoax, something made up, something that is not based in reality. The problem with that, of course, is the last time the elections were turned against the Democratic nominee, there's every reason to think it could work against Republicans next time. So both parties have every reason to counter this, but for whatever reason, the president has not made that a priority.
Yeah, Seth Moulton says that his party hasn't done enough on Russia. He's a Democratic candidate for president, congressman from Massachusetts. Listen.
You're right in criticizing us for not focusing enough on Russia. I mean, that's why I'm in this race, to talk about national security, because Democrats should be leading on national security when we have a president who is literally cozying up to some of the worst dictators in the world, some of our biggest enemies. I do think, Chris, that you're right, that should be the focus, because that is the unmistakable conclusion of this report.
But typically, foreign policy does not play a huge role when Americans go to the voting booth, David.
Right, only if it's a cudgel, if it can be used as a campaign tool. And Congressman Moulton there, he has a point. Back in 2012, the Republican nominee for president, Mitt Romney, talked about Russia as the U.S., America's greatest geopolitical threat. He was dismissed, laughed off by the Democratic ticket, and now we saw what happened the next time around. So it's a little convenient for Democrats to take that line as well.
David Mark. David, thanks very much.
Thank you.
Escalating tensions between the U.S. and Iran could lead to a missile assault against Israel. That's according to an Israeli official, and he's not the only one concerned about the growing strain between the two nations. Here's Katie Hill on the House Armed Services Committee.
We are indeed escalating tensions. I think one of the most telling things to me is that in 2015, John Bolton had an article saying that if you want to stop Iran's bomb, you have to bomb Iran. So he's been, I think, making it pretty clear that they want to move these tensions forward and ultimately come to some kind of a conflict. To me, that's what's scary, because I do think that there are ways to avoid that.
Trey Yingst is following this story from our Jerusalem bureau.
John, as tensions rise between the United States and Iran, the U.S. is sending a second warship to the region, along with a Patriot missile defense system. The USS Arlington will join the USS Abraham Lincoln, a vessel capable of holding up to 90 aircraft in the Persian Gulf. Fox has independently confirmed the move comes after a specific and credible threat against U.S. forces was identified last week by Israeli intelligence services and given to the Americans. A number of B-52 bomber planes were also sent to an airbase in Qatar earlier this week as part of a U.S. readiness preparation. A commander in Iran's Revolutionary Guard said today that if America makes a move against Iranian forces, they would, quote, get hit. The commander adding that U.S. aircraft carriers in the region used to be a threat to Iran, but they are now seen as an opportunity. Iran has called the American military moves, quote, psychological warfare. Today, Israeli Energy Minister Yuval Steinitz said that Iran could fire rockets at Israel. The country also faces increased threats from Iranian proxies in the Middle East, including Hezbollah in Lebanon, and various conflict erupt. These military moves in the Middle East do come as Iran is under immense economic pressure after the Trump administration added yet another sanction last week, this time targeting Iran's industrial metals. John?
Trey Yingst reporting. Trey, thank you. Nearly 2 years after his death, lawmakers are ramping up efforts to get justice for American college student Otto Warmbier. How a new proposal aims to undercut the government that held him in captivity.
The strategy with North Korea hasn't changed. It's a diplomatic one. When it's about full denuclearization, my job is to make sure that we're prepared in the event diplomacy fails. That's my focus with the military. There's no change to our force posture, our force preparation, and our readiness.
Acting Defense Secretary Patrick Shanahan reiterating the Trump administration's position on North Korea in an exclusive Fox and Friends interview. This as Congress ratchets up its efforts to hold the regime responsible for its failure to denuclearize and for the death of American college student Otto Warmbier. Our Eric Shawn has more.
A federal judge in Washington, D.C. ruled Otto Warmbier was falsely arrested, tortured, and sent home to die by the brutal regime of Kim Jong-un because he was an American. Now, there is a push in his name to make the North Korean dictatorship pay for its continued defiance to denuclearize.
This is an opportunity to stand up for Otto, to stand up for a world where bullies cannot have their way.
The Kim regime and Kim himself ultimately needs to be held responsible for just the brutal, horrendous murder of Otto. By putting his name on this legislation, it's a way to keep his memory alive and to remind the world of the atrocity of this regime.
Senator Pat Toomey, Republican of Pennsylvania, and Senator Chris Van Hollen, Democrat of Maryland, have come together in a bipartisan effort to honor Otto and send Kim a blunt message. Otto was a 22-year-old college student from Ohio when he was arrested in 2016 while on a tour of North Korea. The Otto Warmbier Brink Act, short for Banking Restrictions Involving North Korea, would clamp down on banks that illegally support the regime and its nuclear program.
The goal is to put the maximum possible economic pressure on the Kim regime of North Korea.
In effect, would a bank have a choice? Deal with North Korea or deal with us?
Yes, it's either or, right? If you're going to deal with North Korea, you will not have access to the U.S. banking system.
I want them to have to choose. I'm pretty sure I know what choice they'll make, and that is designed to increase the economic pressure on Kim.
The senators say the measure is especially needed now because two recent summits with President Trump have not moved Kim to get rid of his nuclear weapons.
We've seen no progress, no real progress. In fact, maybe some backsliding now. So, yeah, I think it's absolutely time to ratchet up the pressure.
Do you think Kim really wants to give up his nuclear weapons?
No, I don't think so.
Otto's parents, Cindy and Fred Warmbier, support the bill.
Unless we keep the pressure on North Korea, they are not going to change. And I am very afraid that we're going to let up on this pressure.
Analysts say the bill's sanctions could get Kim to back down.
The U.S. really needs to increase its negotiating leverage by enforcing tough sanctions against North Korea and North Korea's partners. Exert enough financial pressure so that Kim grows worried.
Behind the effort is the legacy of Otto, a young man who represented American freedoms and values and whose fate exposed the true face of the Kim regime.
What happened to him really reflects the nature of the North Korean regime and Kim Jong-un. You know, Kim Jong-un, goes around the world, he goes to these summits and with a lot of pomp and circumstance, but he runs a brutal regime that killed an American. And so we thought it was really important to remember Otto.
He falls into the clutches of really a profoundly evil dictator. And, obviously they beat him to death. But the brutality of a regime that would do that, it's a disturbing reminder of how monstrous this regime can be.
That report from our Eric Shawn. More news in just a moment.
The strategy with North Korea hasn't changed. It's a diplomatic one. When it's about full denuclearization, my job is to make sure that we're prepared in the event diplomacy fails. That's my focus with the military. There's no change to our force posture, our force preparation, and our readiness.
Acting Defense Secretary Patrick Shanahan reiterating the Trump administration's position on North Korea in an exclusive Fox and Friends interview. This as Congress ratchets up its efforts to hold the regime responsible for its failure to denuclearize and for the death of American college student Otto Warmbier. Our Eric Shawn has more.
A federal judge in Washington, D.C. ruled Otto Warmbier was falsely arrested, tortured, and sent home to die by the brutal regime of Kim Jong-un because he was an American. Now, there is a push in his name to make the North Korean dictatorship pay for its continued defiance to denuclearize.
This is an opportunity to stand up for Otto, to stand up for a world where bullies cannot have their way.
The Kim regime and Kim himself ultimately needs to be held responsible for just the brutal, horrendous murder of Otto. By putting his name on this legislation, it's a way to keep his memory alive and to remind the world of the atrocity of this regime.
Senator Pat Toomey, Republican of Pennsylvania, and Senator Chris Van Hollen, Democrat of Maryland, have come together in a bipartisan effort to honor Otto and send Kim a blunt message. Otto was a 22-year-old college student from Ohio when he was arrested in 2016 while on a tour of North Korea. The Otto Warmbier Brink Act, short for Banking Restrictions Involving North Korea, would clamp down on banks that illegally support the regime and its nuclear program.
The goal is to put the maximum possible economic pressure on the Kim regime of North Korea.
In effect, would a bank have a choice? Deal with North Korea or deal with us?
Yes, it's either or, right? If you're going to deal with North Korea, you will not have access to the U.S. banking system.
I want them to have to choose. I'm pretty sure I know what choice they'll make, and that is designed to increase the economic pressure on Kim.
The senators say the measure is especially needed now because two recent summits with President Trump have not moved Kim to get rid of his nuclear weapons.
We've seen no progress, no real progress. In fact, maybe some backsliding now. So, yeah, I think it's absolutely time to ratchet up the pressure.
Do you think Kim really wants to give up his nuclear weapons?
No, I don't think so.
Otto's parents, Cindy and Fred Warmbier, support the bill.
Unless we keep the pressure on North Korea, they are not going to change. And I am very afraid that we're going to let up on this pressure.
Analysts say the bill's sanctions could get Kim to back down.
The U.S. really needs to increase its negotiating leverage by enforcing tough sanctions against North Korea and North Korea's partners. Exert enough financial pressure so that Kim grows worried.
Behind the effort is the legacy of Otto, a young man who represented American freedoms and values and whose fate exposed the true face of the Kim regime.
What happened to him really reflects the nature of the North Korean regime and Kim Jong-un. Kim Jong-un, goes around the world, he goes to these summits and a lot of pomp and circumstance, but he runs a brutal